This was this was one of the podcasts that we've been talking about now for about 6 weeks, where typically I get people on individually, but now we've got two entities that I feel like really have synergy when it comes to what you're trying to accomplish. We've got Jimmy Evans with Evans Law Firm, who does family planning and law, family law. And then we've got Seth. I always mess your last name. Howdeshell. Yeah. Seth Howdeshell with, I forget the name of your business, too. And
New Leaf Counseling.
New Leaf Counseling. Mm-hmm. So you've got a family counselor and a family planning or law attorney.
And the guy who busts up families.
Right. Well,
not really.
Sometimes divorce is a beautiful thing. I
bet
that
there's
personally.
A lot of options, too.
There have been couples that I've seen that I say, like, guys, let go of the ski rope. So sometimes I'm that guy, too.
That's a good analogy. Yeah, sometimes you just got to let it go.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, kick it off, Seth. I know you had some questions that you wanted to kind of ask, and then, I'm just kind of here to hang.
It's because we like you.
I appreciate that.
And you're hosting.
Trying to keep things flowing. I'm going to drink my coffee, which was provided by Seth. Yeah. We'll give Summer Moon a plug. There's a free plug
Summer
for
Moon,
you.
my favorite. Yeah.
And Seth, just for your audience, so they know who you're asking questions to, my name is Jimmy Evans. I'm a family law attorney here in Austin, Texas. My law practice is called the Evans Family Law Group. I'm a board-certified family law specialist, been board-certified since December 2010, part of the Texas Monthly Super Lawyers for Family Law Attorneys since, the last 7 or 8 years, and then sat on the statewide council for the last 6 years, but I rolled off, term limited, for the statewide council that writes and grades the exam that creates board-certified family law attorneys in Texas. And as a geeky accomplishment, I wrote 3 of the questions for the last 3 years on the board certification exam. So as we talk about mental health and therapy, and because that's your world, and how they intersect and mix with the divorce and custody world, that way your audience knows who you're talking to.
Yeah.
He's bona fide.
Yeah, that's right.
I don't usually talk about credentials, but people just come on to this won't know.
Sure. So I read your book, Agreed Divorce. Can you give us the full title of it?
Divorce with Dignity. It's about the concept of agreed divorces, but it's really titled Divorce with Dignity. Mm-hmm. The concept being where people who have trust and transparency, that they can come together, that may not like it, that they're getting divorced, they're not comfortable with it, of course, but they can trust the information of the other spouse, and they are transparent with their spouse about that information, that the idea is ultimately to let them control their outcome. And the attorney, which you have to have a very unique philosophy in how to approach it, but it's where the attorney, for lack of a better phrase, doesn't get in the way. Mm-hmm. Right? You kind of let them drive the bus, because what I always tell those clients is, what's best for your family, what's best for your kids. Maybe you have special needs kids. Y'all know your finances, and whatnot. My job in an agreed divorce is basically to tell them what not to do, right? Like what a judge may not approve, but give them the rope to be creative and within the bounds of the law to do things that an ultimate outcome that a judge will approve, and that they know is the right thing for their family.
Okay.
As opposed to a litigated outcome where, we're looking at the law and how to take advantage of that and get the maximum outcome as possible. Completely different approach.
Right. Is there a reason that you choose to call it agreed divorce instead of uncontested divorce? Is there subtle difference there?
Yeah, that's a good question, because there's a very big difference between the two of them. Technically speaking, an uncontested divorce, for example, is one where maybe somebody doesn't even respond. Like, somebody has filed for divorce, they're out of the country, or they're just absent, and somebody just goes to court and defaults them. That's an uncontested divorce. An uncontested divorce might be where the other spouse does get served, is very aware of the process, but just doesn't get involved. Just doesn't participate, doesn't negotiate. An agreed divorce is the concept in my office where the parties are actively discussing. Both parties are participating. Both parties are contributing and manipulating that outcome in a way that they know what's best for their family. So it's meant to be a bilateral, mutual agreed process. That's what it's meant to define.
Right. And how often do you find that, how can I say this question clearly? How often do you find that couples that go through agreed divorce are able to follow through with that, the whole process, and it doesn't end up going to litigation or
In my
Yeah.
office, very few. I mean, I
Mhm.
don't have this mathematically down, but I've done probably 2,000 agreed divorces in the
Mhm.
last, 13 or 14 years since I started doing it. And I can say with some confidence that less than 1%, certainly less than 5%, but probably about 1% or less actually don't follow it through in some
Mhm.
way,
Yeah.
right? And almost none of those go to litigation. It still ends up being something agreed to, but mostly what happens of those 5% is
Right.
another attorney gets involved because sometimes you just run into that issue and somebody just needs an attorney just to give them that advice and push them in
Mhm.
the right direction. Sometimes you just have a legitimate disagreement or difference in perspective and you just need to have a professional help people push through that. But almost none of them in my office that start as an agreed divorce go to litigation. That's exceedingly rare. And the reason for that is, at some point, I'm going to make people sign that commitment, but it's because I tell them right up front, you have to commit to trust and transparency. I'm going to commit to you. By way of definition, agreed divorce in my office also means, for example, when we file that petition for the agreed divorce, we have a custom, I don't know, it's about 40% custom draft for that
Mhm.
original petition. It's that document that you file with the court that gets it all started.
Right.
In Texas, there's a minimum waiting period of 60 days that starts when you file that document. You probably hear about this in your practice, right? But nobody turns into a pumpkin. There's nothing like legally binding about the 60 days. It just means you can't finish the divorce until the 60 days have passed.
Mhm.
So, what I commit to them as they commit to trust and transparency is that I'm not going to do anything behind their back. I'm not going to file anything in court. We're not going to be asking for what's called discovery, like exchanging bank information or credit cards. If somebody's dating somebody, we're not chasing that information. I mean, we're letting you guys work this out. And in the meantime, we have a questionnaire that I give to people that honestly most people don't answer anymore, but it prompts them, for the information that we need. And so I think because of that, and I commit very, very hard to make sure that we follow through on that philosophy to keep people what I call in that agreed divorce box. So even if one of the client's spouse calls me and starts having concerns about, hey, we need to go do something about X, Y, and Z, I'll usually remind them politely, hey, that's not what you've hired me for. We're really trying to do an agreed divorce. Let's figure out how to stay in that box.
Mhm.
It's a silly story, but if I'm lying, I'm dying. I mean, it's a true.
Yeah.
I can't make this one up, but it's an example of my commitment to keeping people agreed. Had a couple who was working a long time on their agreed divorce. They had a lot of assets, so it was a little complex. And it was about 7 months into the process, which is unusually long. But we had made a lot of progress. And they called me about 7 o'clock one night, and on my cell phone caught me, and they both were at Eddie V's having dinner and had
Right.
finalized the terms of their agreement. And because they'd been working so hard, they are aware that I'm sort of infamously known for bringing a portable printer everywhere I go.
Oh, okay.
And they knew about that, and so they asked me, and they offered to pay me, of course, but they asked me if I would come down to the restaurant, bring my printer, and finish the terms and print it all out so they could sign it. And I said, of course, I'm on my way, and so
A bottle of
Um,
wine makes everything
y'all
we
easier.
did
toast?
share some wine.
Yeah.
I'm not going to lie about that, but I know
Takes
from
the edge off.
I know because of my litigation practice what that creates, the anxiousness and the conflict and what that does. So I knew professionally that from their perspective, having their attorney show up and do that, the weight that would lift off of their shoulders, which was true. I mean, it made them feel, wow, like this is done,
Mhm.
And so, and I have lots of stories, not quite as dramatic, but I have lots of stories like that where, you got to keep people in that agreed box. So
Right.
that's the commitment.
Do you
Right.
think the reason that they're staying in those agreed divorces is because they're coming into it and they know what they're doing, or do you think you're managing it?
I think it's both. I mean, it's not for everybody.
Right.
You've got to have the right personality profiles, and that trust and transparency is just key. You'll hear me just keep saying that because if somebody's not trusting the information and somebody's not being transparent, it's eventually going to boil over,
Sure.
and somebody's just going to say, "Well, I'll just go get my own attorney."
Yeah, I see a lot of couples in my practice who have the idea that they would like agreed upon divorce or would like to mediate, they have this idea that that's the more positive way to go. But I think one of the myths or misconceptions my clients have is that you order this thing, mediation and agreed upon divorce, and you show up and then it happens to you. And so I often have to educate my clients and help them through the process of making an attitudinal shift so that they're willing to be open and willing to be generous in the process. And sometimes we call it having a mentality of wealth, which means, hey, like, slow down. There's enough to go around. If you listen, sometimes. If you listen and understand your partner's, the other parent's fear, concerns, they're going to listen to yours. And so I have to help them with that attitudinal shift, because they often think of agreed upon divorce as just a product, but they don't realize it's actually going to be difficult to be transparent and vulnerable. And
It's a process.
It's a process,
Yeah.
right? It's not a product. It's a process that results in an outcome, but there's definitely a process, and you have to commit to that. And those things that you're talking about are key, because it's this culture of what I've coined, because I've done a lot of radio interviews about this, but I've coined this culture of adversarialness, right?
Right.
Like, when you bring up the D word, automatically you're
fight or flight.
I got to fight.
Yeah.
Right. And the whole idea behind agreed divorces is to take that out of the room. I know it's uncomfortable. It's like passing gas, and everybody's like, "Who did that?" But I know it's uncomfortable. But there is a process where we can do this, where everybody can control the outcome. And you may not like it. It's a process that you can live with and be comfortable with, and know that it was the best outcome for your family.
Mm-hmm.
That's the agreed divorce process. It's very different. Can I address one thing you brought up? You said
Sure.
mediation versus agreed divorces, and mediation's very different. Mediation in Texas, and I get a lot of calls about that, because a lot of people want the agreed divorce, and they'll call me and ask if I'll do their mediation. Mediation is a very technical process. It has its own defined section of the law. And a mediator, like let's say myself, or a qualified mediator, can be a mediator for a couple, but the mediation process is where that mediator, one, by law, has to remain neutral, so he or she cannot advocate for either of the parties.
Right.
Legally and technically, that mediator is not allowed to answer legal questions.
Mm-hmm.
And so if the parties are in their pro se or representing themselves, I mean, they're going to have questions that come up, and the mediator's technically not allowed to answer those questions. And third, the process of mediation is where the mediator facilitates a dialogue where the parties then come up with their agreement, right? And depending on the quality of that mediator and how much experience they have in family law depends on the quality of that agreement. Because I've seen some pretty bad ones.
Right.
And the good and the bad of a mediated settlement agreement is the moment you sign it, it is binding and irrevocable under the laws of the state of Texas. You can't get out of it. And so if people who are without lawyers, perfectly well-intended, go to mediation with who they thought was a qualified mediator and sign what somebody like me would go, well, this is a really crappy document, you're stuck with it, unless the parties are willing to agree to it. The last thing that's major difference between mediation and the agreed divorce is the mediator's not authorized under the law to then go finish the documents. Like, you have to then take that agreement, go draft the divorce decree, deeds, or retirement documents to split up retirement, or whatever it might be, and that mediator can't help you with that. So you're going to end up probably going and hiring another professional anyway. That's what's unique about our agreed divorce process, besides what we just talked about, is I help them do that from A to Z. And
Right,
so,
and you can legally answer those questions.
and I can,
everything
through
like
my
that.
client, legally answer those questions. Yeah.
Got it. So I have a question, and this will show if I was a good reader and understood your book, or did not understand it, wasn't a good reader. But so, technical question. When you do an agreed divorce, you are serving as the attorney for one of the parties technically?
Yes, sir.
They have to, one of the individuals has to choose, who's going to have you as their attorney, and then the other one kind of goes along with that.
Yeah, this is often one of the first hurdles to overcome, and it's one of the reasons why I like meeting with both of the couple or the parties at first, like up front, to explain the process. Because sometimes it's that the anxiousness is just that feeling that my spouse is hiring the attorney. Like you have an attorney, and we have all these credentials and whatever, and you know you can go take 5 minutes and read about our litigation practice, and that's who's representing you. Like it makes people feel anxious, right? And so and maybe want to go get their own attorney. So that's where I commit back to them trust and transparency, right? So the way that I handle that, and because ethically I can't represent both people, and so if their spouse has questions, in the book I talk about examples, and I joke about the toaster story, where you know somebody's going to ask that a question where I just can't answer it. And it's going to, and I always joke, it feels like that's the moment the elephant poops in the room. You know,
Right.
it's just this awkward moment. We're sitting here, we're trying to have this well-meaning conversation to come to terms and be agreeable, right? And the attorney in the room says, "I'm sorry, sir or ma'am, I ethically I can't answer that question. You're just gonna have to get your own attorney." And then I have to stop.
Right.
And imagine how your listeners who just
Yeah.
heard that feel. I mean,
Right.
so after that happened twice, I
Mhm.
stopped. I said, that's completely antithetical to what I'm trying to do. And so what I started doing after that, and it's worked like a charm ever since, is based on our trust and transparency rule, I say to the client, if you guys trust each other, you spouse who's not represented, bring your questions, right,
Mhm.
through my client.
Mhm.
Because ethically, I don't have the same limitations with my client.
Okay.
I can answer those questions all day long as my client instructs me to answer.
Yeah.
Then I can answer those questions without limitation,
Right.
right?
Right.
And then my communication to my client is confidential, and my client can choose to do whatever they want with that communication.
Mhm.
So, you know, most of those are done by email.
Mhm.
And of course, I'm drafting that in a way that I know they're going to print and share that with their spouse. I'm not going to say that I think at times that my client has orchestrated a Zoom conference where maybe the other party's off
In the
camera,
background, right?
and I don't know they're in the room. You
Right.
know?
Gotcha.
As long as I
But
don't know they're
if
in
you
the
don't
room.
know that, right?
As long as I don't know that and they're not participating, and I think I'm talking just to my client or on the speakerphone, those are ways for me ethically to work around that.
Mhm.
Yeah, and
The
so that's how I
gray-
do that. You
Right.
know, and then I tell the other spouse that's how I do that. And look, and if he or she, the client's not doing that and sharing that with you, I mean, you're going to start to feel pretty anxious about not sharing that information. So what are you going to do? You're going to go get your own attorney. So you, client, I will say, make sure you do what you need to do to be transparent about that information.
Right.
That's one of the uniqueness, probably the most unique thing about the way I manage that process.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's cool. So when I work with clients that are going through the divorce process, I often see them figure things out that would have been great for them to figure out before they finish the divorce process. And one of the things that I see happen is before the divorce process, they do not have important conversations about their conflict or their questions because it's too charged and it's too high stakes at that point, and they're still in an adversarial mindset. And then when the divorce process is over and there's nothing to lose, they often have these good conversations at that point that could have solved some problems
Yeah.
before they went through this whole thing. So one thing I try to teach couples is, hey, what are those important conversations that you're not having? And I help them figure out, maybe what some of those questions should be. But I was curious, from you, what can you teach my clients about what you've seen couples learn through the process? What would you like couples to know before they go through divorce or agreed upon divorce? What are the things you would like them to know that they often don't figure out till it's all said and done?
Well, we're talking about agreed divorce, right?
Yeah.
Because it's very different the other way. But for an agreed divorce, and I know I'm beating a dead horse, but that transparency is like super key. Because I would tell you, besides things like adultery or alcohol or addictions or mental health, like the obvious stuff, control of finances and not sharing that information is one of the things that creates that super high level of anxiety. and so that's one thing is make sure that you're as transparent as you possibly can. I would also caution people if they're going into this process to not create what I call anchors. There's a different because anchoring is a concept I talk about in the book. Where one time, and I'll just tell the story real quick. But one time I represented an engineer who they had several different businesses, and he gave her and they were trying to be transparent. He gave her several versions of an Excel. And he didn't understand inventory exactly right, so he misvalued, if you will, overinflated some value of some inventory of one of their businesses. And then by the time they got attorneys and they got professional business valuators involved, right, to correctly value the business, it dropped by I'll never forget, it was right at $600,000. And she was so convinced that he lied to her and that he was hiding that $600,000 that we spent almost 10 months and untold amount of fees and expenses to wind up exactly with the less than 600, the correct valuations, less the 600. He just made a mistake. It was an honest mistake because he didn't know. And that's the concept I learned in that moment. That's called anchoring. And so you've got to, because you anchored in her mind that it was 3.3 million, not 2 point whatever, 6.
Right.
And she was so anchored to that concept that she was going to get that extra money. So you got to be really careful about inside the transparency process, be transparent, but not necessarily committing to an outcome when you're not really sure, what direction you're going in terms of what the agreement's going to look like. Right. There's a difference when couples up front really have a solid idea of what they're going to do versus they're just kind of putting their toes in the water and trying to figure it out.
Right.
And if you're in the latter, you want to be careful with that anchoring, even though you have the best of intentions, because anchoring can cause a real problem.
Do you run into situations where you find that you feel people are not being transparent? And if so, how do you deal with that?
In an agreed divorce?
Yeah.
No, because if I feel that way, I just call people out on it. And I'll just threaten to withdraw or not finish it or just tell them what's really going to happen is they're just going to go get their another lawyer, and they're going to force you to disclose all that anyway.
Gotcha.
So, don't do it.
Does that happen?
Really rare. It does with my litigation clients.
Sure, of course.
They want to hide the cash under the stairwell, but
right.
Yeah. But not in the agreed divorce. Most people aren't coming at it from that frame of mind,
So, what's your percentage of?
One more thing that I just thought of is the other thing is because we now have this what I call a shadowverse. We have AI and we have Google and friends who've been through divorce, right? Lots of them, apparently.
I know where you're going with this, yeah.
And everybody thinks they know the law, right? They think they like separate property. That's a big one, or child support, And what happens is it's probably one of besides anchoring and non-transparency, it's pretty high, ranks high up there, where somebody just puts their foot down in an agreed divorce and says, look, that's just my separate property, or
we see that all the time
I'm not
in my
paying
business.
more than X. This is what I found it on Google, or I read a case, or this is what my friend, Joe, that's what his lawyer said.
I bought it before the marriage.
Yeah. And,
I get that all the time.
It's an agreed divorce, those things may happen. We may end up at that place, but when you up front, if you draw those lines, it makes your other spouse immediately feel that adversarialness, right? And that conflict, and it makes them want to go get an attorney and protect themselves. So to be successful, you want to try to avoid those three things in an agreed divorce, or commit to trust and transparency, avoid the anchoring, but be transparent,
right?
And don't put your foot down on something until the time's right.
Yeah.
Doesn't mean we won't, or you won't, but not right up front.
Yeah. Got it.
Make your spouse be heard, because being heard is a huge one. Just hear them out.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I'm curious, what percentage of your practice is non-agreed divorce?
It's most of
it. Yeah. And
75% of it.
Yeah. And what kinds of things, I'm trying to make this question clear as well, what kinds of things do you think about if you've got a client that you're coaching or helping figure out which direction to go? What are the indicators that they might be a candidate for agreed divorce, or they're probably not, maybe even if they were thinking about it or curious about agreed divorce?
It's usually pretty obvious up front. Even the ones that end up with another attorney on the other side, it doesn't mean it doesn't end up being this knockdown drag out. Usually it still is amicable, but they just need to go through the process. They need to get financial information, or maybe it's complex with taxes or capital gains or retirement or whatever it might, or they have some tax liability they need to figure out or whatever. Sometimes people just need that other professional, but that doesn't mean it's not amicable or that it won't end up being agreed. It just is a little more expensive sometimes.
Yeah.
But honestly, most of the time it's pretty obvious. I mean, either they come together for the initial interview or intake, as we call it, or it's pretty obvious from the intake with that potential client that that's the process they want. And so I'll explain that as an option, and if that's what they want, then I'll usually suggest that as the next step. Let's get on a call together so I can explain this process, Otherwise, it's usually pretty clear that they need a different process. It is more common that people call thinking it's agreed, and then in the intake they give me information. I'm like, oh no,
Right.
this is not an agreed divorce, and here's why, and here's what the process that you need to follow.
Got it.
So it's usually pretty obvious up
Right,
front.
right. Do you ever, through the process, refer people to counseling with someone like
Yeah,
me
a
during the
lot.
process? Yeah.
Yeah.
What kind of stuff do you see that they need help with?
Probably the most common way to answer that would be to learn to communicate, because they've got kids, right? And they just need to learn to talk to each other. They know they're going to be divorced, but they need to learn to be on the same bench at the volleyball,
Right.
game.
Yeah.
Or be, chairs away from each other at the soccer tournament, and know that your spouse is going to be there with their next girlfriend or boyfriend or whatever. You got to have somebody who can help them swallow a bubble, relax,
Yeah.
and learn to handle that situation. Because there's so many dynamics that go into that, but that's where kids really are affected. It's not so much divorce, in my opinion; it's how they handle it. And it's even worse when it's high conflict after. It's one thing during, kids kind of expect it, whatever. Most kids, they have kids and friends their parents have gone through it, and there's so much information available now. Kids are affected, don't get me wrong, but it's worse, in my opinion, when it's post-divorce. Like, and it just keeps, the conflict just keeps happening. So oftentimes I'll recommend, I won't say it's often written in, but oftentimes in that I'll recommend that they write in like a parenting coach, which can be a person like yourself, and oftentimes it is, like a mental health provider. To help them learn to manage and navigate that, just be co-parents together. The family code contemplates what's called a parenting facilitator or a parenting coordinator. I mean, we're not going to go into all that. I prefer to have somebody like yourself who has a much broader role under the orders, for the parents. And so, and then sometimes parents will get an individual therapist for themselves and then a separate family therapist. And then the individual therapists are coordinating, with the family therapist, so everybody kind of gets on the same page. So, yeah, it's not uncommon at all.
Yeah. So that sparked my brain for another question. And I'm not sure if in this situation, my interest as a therapist would be in alignment or opposition to an attorney's interests. But when I see clients, part of my consent is I let them know if I'm going to agree to be your therapist, I'm not going to provide information that would be used as testimony or
in court.
information in court. And of course, there could be a situation where a judge subpoenas my information and I have to give that out. But in general,
But you're not going to voluntarily do
I'm not
it.
going to voluntarily do it because let's say I'm working with a couple and one person drops out of counseling, but the other person stays with me. And now they want me to help them in their case against their spouse, who is a former client of mine. I can't do something that's going to ruin a relationship with even a former client because they could come back. Once a client, always a client.
Yeah, that's a tricky dual role, kind of.
It's a dual role, yeah. But occasionally that kind of thing can happen. So, for that reason, I don't like to get involved with a court case because then my client is no longer just shopping for therapy, they're also shopping for, they want me to assist them in a
Ammunition.
positive outcome.
Yeah.
And that's a different product and a different service. And if I have a client who wants that from me, they're not going to share with me the same information in a counseling session.
Yeah, that's not therapy.
That's
You know,
not therapy
that's strategy.
at that point.
Yeah.
So I guess my question is, under what circumstances, what have you seen in terms of courts or attorneys seeking information from therapists?
Well, it's common,
Yeah.
you know, and certain attorneys, and I'll put myself in that category, try to be very respectful to the mental health professional community because I worked with a lot of them,
Mm-hmm.
and I think I've generated a good working relationship with a lot of folks over the years. Having private conversations, for example, that I assure them I will never bring up in court, but I need to know what's really going on. I have those kind of relationships with a lot of mental health providers. And unfortunately, too many family law attorneys have gone after, if you will, or you know, had their gun sights set on some of these a lot of mental health professionals to the point that now, if there's a court case, they just won't touch it. You know, it's people complain, they'll file complaints from your license. You know, they'll drag you into court and drag your records, and so
The therapist won't touch it? Is it?
yeah, and so at this
Right.
point,
Yeah.
having because unfortunately it's a dual-sided problem because you know therapists, qualified good therapists,
Mhm.
you know, who when there's a case going on, whether custody or divorce, it's a real need.
Mhm.
I mean, people need it, the kids need it, but when there's active litigation because of that history, the amount of you know qualified mental health professionals, and I say qualified, you know, who will touch a case like that are minuscule.
Mhm.
I mean, less than you know my hand. I mean, they're very very few, and those who do, they're well known at the courthouse and they're comfortable with it and they can handle it. You know, but it's not fun for you guys. I mean, so,
Mhm.
but it's I don't blame mental health professionals for doing that. I can't give you advice, but I certainly would have in my contract a very you know specified fee,
Yeah.
you know, and all that. And I've had a therapist just come to court and say, you know, I haven't been paid. You know, there's a couple of lawyers in town that represent only mental health professionals, and that's all they do.
Mhm.
You know, and so if you ever start to get into that kind of world, that's probably what you should do is just put one of them on. There's really only two, and put one of them on retainer.
Mhm.
You know, so
Yeah.
it's it's a need. It's a real need, but there's just not that many. And I don't blame you for not
Mhm.
wanting to get involved with the litigation. You know, but it's also a real need. So it's more common than you think.
Yeah. Well, it's the other interesting thing is sometimes my own clients think that the information that I have in their record is going to help them. And
Yeah.
I often say, well, be careful what you ask for because I'm not sure if just because you like me and I'm your therapist, I'm nice to you, I'm not sure if my information is going to be helpful to your case. you know?
Exactly. They need to be, yeah. And oftentimes what I'll do in that situation is I'll get the HIPAA release, you know, from the
Mhm.
client, and I'll call you. I'll send you the release by email, just introduce myself and just say, hey, can we talk? You know,
Mhm.
because before I do that, I want to find out, am I stepping into a briar patch with my own client, you know?
Right,
So,
right.
yeah.
Yeah. I've had that happen many times where the attorney calls me and says, okay, nice chatting with you, and
Thank
we're going
you.
to leave you alone.
Yeah.
Right,
Yeah.
yeah. So you mentioned something, Jimmy, when we were having coffee a month ago about parental alienation. Yeah. You seem to have a lot of feelings and passion about that subject and some experience with that subject. So can you tell my audience a little bit about what that is and what you see happening?
Well, what we talked about, I think, is I know a couple of unquestioned experts in that category.
Well, can we define what parental alienation
Yeah.
is first?
Well, that's what I was about to say. There's different kinds of ways to define it, but I mean, the way I know it, and the professionals are defining it now under the DSM-5 or 6 with a different term. But I think the way your audience would define parental alienation, from the way I see it, is where the one parent essentially creates through comments, actions, conduct, or whatever experiences with a child, right? That essentially makes that child feel
Mhm.
unsafe or have memories or feel experiences about the other parent which they don't want to be involved with or fear that other parent, and those experiences aren't really real.
Mm-hmm.
You know, or there's
Right.
some shred of reality in it, but it forces that child to act on those feelings that or those experiences to feel a certain way based on experiences that are disproportionate to how that child becomes to feel about that other parent. That's
Yeah.
What
probably
would
the
be like
non-technical
what would be
way
like
to
a
explain
broad
it.
stroke example of that?
Making a child believe they were the subject of sexual abuse.
Okay.
I mean, that's a exaggerated but a very real,
Sure.
concrete example.
And
right?
then what
You
would be-
abused me for years. I'm not gonna go around that person.
Right.
And
And what would be something that would be a little less extreme?
It's usually a lot more subtle, and the
Right.
term grooming, also applies here. But it's things like, your mom, doesn't have your best interest when this,
Okay.
right.
or medication is another common one. Like your mom doesn't believe in that.
Gotcha.
And I'm the only one who's supporting you with your medication. You need that medication, and it's real subtle.
Mm-hmm.
And ultimately, it obviously can become a real problem, and it's very difficult to identify because alienation's not the same as what we call alignment. Where a kid's just mad at their dad.
Yeah.
And doesn't want to go spend time with them. Alienation's a very, very different thing, and it's complex. And how to treat it, how to address it in court is expensive, and there's very few professionals that can really address it.
When you see parental alienation, do you feel like it's intentional, or do you feel like it's almost something that the parent that is doing the parental alienation is almost doing just
out of defense
spite?
mechanism.
Yeah,
Yeah.
so the targeted parent, right, the one experiencing the brunt of the alienation,
Correct.
always thinks it's intentional.
Okay.
But there's two different forms.
right?
There's what's called conscious alienation, which
Sure.
is what you just described, where
Right.
they're just out to get the other parent,
Mm-hmm.
and it's very intentional.
Right.
This course of conduct and this grooming.
And I would envision that's easy to identify. But what about
Not
the la-
always.
Well,
Yeah,
okay.
not always.
So what about the latter?
And the latter is what's called unconscious alienation, where it's quite possible that parent has been a true victim themselves
Mm-hmm.
of abuse, family violence, whatever, a horrible circumstance in their life. Like, somebody who experienced childhood trauma,
Mm-hmm.
and this is really common, where they just bring that trauma, they haven't resolved that trauma, right, with their mama or their dad or whatever, or maybe a violent sexual assault or a gun situation, they were shot or something, and they bring that into the relationship.
Sure.
And
Horrible ex-boyfriend prior to the marriage.
all that
Right.
are good examples, and they bring that in. Then they bring that overprotectiveness unconsciously to their kiddo,
Mm-hmm.
thinking that they have to protect that kiddo from that experience. And I know that's sort of overly
Man,
complex.
you sound
but
like a therapist.
I've
right
seen
there.
that happen,
Yeah.
and I've been on both
Do you
sides.
feel
of
one
it.
is more common than the other?
Unconscious is probably way more common.
Right.
Yeah.
That's what I would envision.
And
Yeah.
I've had to call because I've been on both sides of it to the point that I can now identify it, and I'll actually sit. It's moms typically. I mean, to be honest,
Mhm.
and I'll have to sit them down and say, "Look, this is you got to stop."
Right. This is not okay.
Because the problem is, you'll hit a point where they think they're protecting this kiddo
Mm-hmm.
from whatever they've experienced, but it's not really happening.
Right.
And if you have a decent attorney on the other side, what I try to explain to that parent is at some point the system's going to bite back on you because they're going to realize that this isn't really happening, or what you're claiming is highly disproportionate to reality.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Even though you know and feel that this happened, the courts won't get that, and the professionals will turn on you and take that child from you.
Right.
They'll eventually remove that child and put them in the hands of what you think is your abuser. And so you got to stop.
Yeah.
And then it goes from there in terms of court strategy and all that. But I've had to, especially claims of sexual abuse. The hardest one is where you've got like a 4-year-old.
Mhm.
I mean, I'm sure you've seen this,
Mhm.
right? A 3-year-old who
Mhm.
can't
Who
articulate
speak for
anything,
themselves,
and the mom is convinced, that the child has been sexually abused. And I'm a former sex crimes prosecutor. I mean, I spent 2 years prosecuting those things. And that's the worst because it could have happened.
Yeah.
And the mom sees things maybe that could have happened, but 99% of the time, there's no forensics to back that up.
Mm-hmm.
You know, there's no way to prove it. But the child has said something about a pee-pee in her butt or whatever, and the mom is convinced.
Mm-hmm.
And she may be, that's the hard part, because she may be absolutely 100% correct that that happened. But in our system, she can take that too far.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and so we can have a whole other discussion around that. But that's an example of unconscious alienation, you know,
Right.
kind of a thing.
So what's common?
Now I feel like the elephant just pooped in the room.
Well, you asked the question.
Hey, yeah, there it is.
So what's common with my couples that I see is that, you know, maybe one parent isn't trying to remove the other one from custody, but they're unconsciously or consciously presenting to their child that your other parent is an asshole.
Yeah.
And they're doing that because they're venting and they're kind of using their child as a sounding board. And that creates all other kinds of problems, you know, later down the line. But would that be a form of parental alienation? Are you talking about when there's more of a legal implication where they're seeking to remove custody or something like that?
Well, it's not defined that way. I mean, because alienation can happen whether there's legal proceedings or not.
Or not.
Yeah.
Right. Okay.
You know, but what you just described is also a very common experience in custody matters, where especially as kids get older, right? Like probably in the 12, 13, especially 15, 16 range.
Right.
Because you're kind of having these sort of adult conversations with them. You know, but to be that child's sounding board, that's the concept that you said. That is, and if I knew the camera, I would look at it and say, that's just don't do that.
it. Don't do it.
Don't do it.
Yeah.
You know, because you don't realize how much your kids already know more than you realize. I mean, they're hearing your conversations. They know. They're already feeling your stress. They already know that.
Yeah.
And when you throw that and you think you're just having a rational conversation about what you're feeling or what your dad did or whatever, you're just throwing gas, you know, on a fire, and you don't realize how much you're putting on them, and they truly can't process it. 16. They just, you know, they just can't.
I can appreciate, as much as I agree with you, the rule is don't do it, don't ever do it. But that parent that's hurting and is in pain from the divorce, they often utilize self-discipline 99% of the time to keep their kid from being in the middle, but it's that 1% where they get exhausted or especially in a situation where they try to discipline themselves like that, but the other parent doesn't. You know, and they just openly have these conversations. And at some point, even as a family law attorney, I'll say, look, you just got to start having that conversation. But the real way to handle that, the right way, honestly, is to get a family therapist. That's right.
And, you know, just and give that child the freedom inside of that process to say, you know, whatever they need to say. It really should be, I know it's family therapy, but it really should be to allow that child to have that safe space to confront their parents and process with whatever's going on. It's rare that people will actually do that, but the people that have done that, at my recommendation, that's gold.
Yeah.
I mean, it really is very productive.
Yeah. I find that a lot of people who get into that parental alienation kind of discourse or talk, they don't trust themselves to be able to solve problems, have boundaries, express themselves in more mediated ways, and so they go ballistic. You know, they go overboard, and so that's part of what I have to do is teach people to have boundaries in what they communicate, how they solve problems, slow down a little bit. You know.
Yeah, it's that's a whole different topic.
Yeah.
And we really should bring Loretta Mace is one of those experts, or I know several psychologists in town that, you know, we could have that discussion for 2 hours on just that topic, and how it and how it can meld into your practice and how to manage that. It's super complex.
Yeah,
it's super complex.
Yeah,
you know.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate everything you had to offer, Jimmy. Is there anything else you wanted to say?
Yeah, you and I were talking about, because if I was, it's a common question. Sometimes people will call me agreed divorce. They think they're contemplating that. They're in therapy with you, you know, and they're trying to figure out, like, when's the right time for me to do this, you know? And one of the litmus tests, if there is one, right? And you've heard me talk about this whole time, is transparency. And so, if your client is the one, which is very common in therapy, that does not have control of the information of the finances, in particular around the family,
Right.
before somebody hires me, or sometimes they'll hire me just behind the scenes, which I call ghosting, and I'll tell them before we file or commit to that, ask that person as part of your therapy, right, to share that information.
Get that out on the table.
I mean,
right?
because I'm finding out as part of my therapy that this is a source of my anxiousness or whatever it is, right?
Right.
My inability to be
Right.
with you or whatever's going on or our conflict, I'm realizing, and make it about you, but ask them to share that. And then you get to the P word. I need the password.
Right.
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 And that
Right.
means passwords. And if we want to sit down and do it together, that's fine. But I need an Excel or something that just shares that information. That, more often than not, the ones who say, sure, no problem, that's an agreed divorce.
Yeah.
The ones who don't, knowing their spouse is saying that as part of my therapy, I need this, that's a
Right.
pretty bright line.
Yeah.
That's probably time
Sure.
to go ahead and file. Doesn't mean it's
Yeah.
going to be a big fight or anything, but that's probably a good bright line.
And to add another layer to that, so if I see that happen, that one party doesn't want to give the password or share that financial
P word.
information, the P word, then that's part of my job, is helping the reticent individual explore their fears or concerns or anxieties with sharing that
Yeah, what's gonna
information.
happen?
And sometimes I can help resolve their irrational fears and anxieties about that, and then it can happen.
Well, because what happens in the reverse is it creates irrational fear and anxiety in the spouse not in control of that information. Their brain just starts going
That's
everywhere.
what I was thinking. It's like now I'm
And-
thinking a million things.
And all of a
Right.
sudden, that
What are we gonna find?
adversarialness becomes heightened,
Right.
times 10, and it becomes completely irrational. And then, unfortunately, that other spouse in control of the information realizes that's completely irrational, and then everybody's just off on their own,
Right.
their own corner, ready to fight at that point.
Yeah.
Another concept that comes up a lot is when somebody's in individual counseling. This is a really complex one because their spouse is experiencing mental health issues, and they feel guilty, right, about separating from that spouse because they know it's the bipolar. Right. They know it's the medication, or they know it's their spouse not on medication.
Yeah.
And the spouse they met 10 years ago is a great husband or a great dad, or mom or whatever. That's a tricky one because what I would tell a client in that situation is it's really, first of all, it's a personal decision you have to make, right? And the divorce process, even in that situation, doesn't mean you're making them out to be your enemy or that you're even going to make it out to be about that, right? You can do it in a loving, respectful way. You can approach it that way, but you haven't have an attorney that'll do that, right? But the litmus test, if there is one, in my opinion, is not the personal decision that people wrangle with. It's safety, right? And it can be safety in one of two ways. It can be your own personal safety or that of your kiddo or kiddos. There has to come a point, because it's often the case when there's a lot of verbal abuse or even a lot of physical abuse, that mom or that dad, moms will take it for the benefit of their kids, for the protection of their kids. But there comes a point when you're actually not protecting your kids. You're enabling that process and that cycle of abuse to just happen, even if it's through mental health or substance abuse. And if that's happening, that to me is another litmus test. Like you need to take some steps and at least get legal separation accomplished. Get yourself and your kids in a safe space and get legal orders, that can do that, and then focus on your spouse's mental health or substance abuse issues or whatever. But that's another probably litmus test that I would tell people, because otherwise somebody can wrangle themselves to the ground about the guilt of separating, but from somebody who's experiencing substance abuse or mental health issues.
Right.
But at some point you've got to set that boundary.
Right.
You know.
Right. Man, this has been so great to hear all this information you have to share, and your book's great. I've given it to many clients already since I
Okay.
read it a month ago. So thank
Well, we
you
still
so
have
much.
10 minutes, man. I mean, I told him when I got here, I said I got to do a hard stop at 10 because I do have an 11 o'clock up in Georgetown.
Oh, you
And
got
I'm
a drive.
watching you watch the clock. We're good, man. I got time. So like, I know there's other things you guys wanted to touch on, and I'm hanging, man.
I got a client at 10, so I've got.
Oh, so it's
Oh,
not
so
me, it's
it's
you.
him.
Right.
Fair enough. Well,
But
then
I would like to do this again.
Yeah.
we absolutely need
Yeah.
to do this again.
Yeah.
I mean, at the end of the day, I feel like there's a bunch of things that even hell, I've got some questions. So,
Oh,
and I think
yeah.
that this is one of those things that, this whole podcast is designed ultimately to allow people to kind of troll and get information that they might be afraid to ask because let's face it, what you guys do, they're sensitive situations.
Topics, yeah.
They're sensitive topics. They're things that people don't necessarily want to come out and, contact an attorney directly, but they want to know. And then, you call it the Shadowverse.
Yeah.
It's like, can I get qualified information through the internet? And I think that the short answer is no. So having you two on here, licensed professionals talking about situations that people really want the answers to, I think this is really good stuff. And I do really want to have you guys back on. So you know how to book.
Yeah,
You're right across the hall.
I had a client yesterday that we got into this topic that it probably is also relevant to your last point that we were talking about is, in other words, in setting that boundary, right? Like in getting the process started. I use the analogy sometimes with not sometimes, a lot of times with a client that's in that situation where they're the victim and they're experiencing, the verbal abuse or the physical abuse or whatever, but they're in it for the benefit of their kids. And I use this analogy all the time. Like, when you're flying on a commercial airline and, they bring down the masks and who do they tell you to put the mask on first?
Yourself.
Yourself, right?
Right.
So the whole point is because if you pass out, you can't save your kid.
Yeah.
And so the point being, even inside of this universe, that if you don't get yourself healthy and you don't get oxygen, right, then you're no bueno to your kiddo or your friends or your family or anybody around you.
That's
and
a great
sometimes
point.
you have to just grab the mask, set that boundary. And even if that means starting the process, what I was explaining to this client yesterday, it doesn't mean you finish it.
Yeah.
It doesn't mean y'all get divorced.
Yeah.
But sometimes you have to use that process to kind of push somebody to get healthy or get into a better place.
Yeah, right. And
and-
in the worst situations where there's one parent who's really addicted or really in a serious mental health crisis and they're really not living in a healthy way, the parent who feels guilty about or leaving, once they create a separate environment, that child actually has a safe place that they can go to half the time.
Yeah.
So instead of hurting the family by breaking the family up, it actually helps
It
that
often
child.
makes them much different.
Yeah, it lets the child know, okay, life doesn't have to be this way.
Yeah, and I don't want to be overly dramatic, but it's also, I mean, look, let's face it, shootings and stuff have become way more common, and there's
Right.
lots of reasons for that. But so if somebody's in that scenario, I just want to be clear that just because you start the process, you can use that process to try to get that other spouse in a healthier place and get you and your kiddo,
Right.
or just you or
Right.
whatever, in a safer
Right.
place,
Yeah.
right? And because
sometimes
it's
just
too common.
changing a variable or creating a structural shift like that will realign
change.
things.
And then introduce Seth
Yeah.
for family therapy, and maybe things can get a lot better. so.
Yeah.
Right on. Well, gentlemen, I appreciate it. We'll schedule another time. I think
Sounds
we got
good.
another hour and a
Yeah.
half in us.
All right.
right.
Thank
All
you.
right, guys.
guys.
Thanks.